The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Welcome back to The Quiet Professional. Today, we are going to be talking about Canadian history with a focus on Indigenous affairs, and then we'll get into some current events. For that, I have Karen Restoule here. Karen is a graduate of the University of Toronto Osgoode Hall's intensive program in Aboriginal lands, resources, and governments, as well as the University of Ottawa's French Common Law program, where she was inducted into the Faculty of Law Honours Society. She is currently the Director of Indigenous Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm going to give a shout out to them because I've spoken with a lot of people from there. Karen regularly contributes to news media, radio, and conferences across Canada and abroad on Indigenous economic and governance reconciliation. And now she also hosts the podcast Breakthrough Nation, which I believe started just back in this past December. It spotlights people whose ambition, grit, and sense of duty are moving Canada forward. She is also an Ojibwe from the Dokas First Nation, who are signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. Welcome, Karen.
Thanks so much for having me, Nathan.
Hey, I appreciate getting you on here. It was a little back and forth so we can make this work, but you know what? This is, to be full, frank, and fair, one of the conversations I was most looking forward to in my upcoming calendar. So I'm happy to make this work, and I think it'll be a good discussion, especially for the listeners. I think they'll get a lot out of this. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Where we usually start with people is just talking a bit about them and how they even got into what they're into. So, you know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself outside of what I gave in the bio, and what brought you to talking about these things for a living?
Yeah, if you look at my resume and try to piece it together, usually people, at least people, very confused because on face value, there's no natural thread throughout the various chapters in the various chapters throughout my career. But to me, there's an obvious trend in that I get really, really excited with challenges. And so by nature, over my entire life, even as a kid, I absolutely loved building things and fixing things. And not that I knew that about myself until, a good decade into my career. But looking back on my life, both professionally and personally, I love a good challenge. And that's pretty much been the impetus for every, every opportunity that I've taken in. I grew up in Sudbury, so northeastern Ontario. I would have, I'm First Nations, I'm Ojibwe. But my dad raised us in town. He would have grown up in our community in Dokas. And so we would have been going there on weekends and getting shipped off to my grandmother's during the summer to the reserve, to the res. And it was largely important to my dad that we maintain that connection, to have, a strong sense of knowing who we are, where we come from, who our relations are. Grew up in a family that was big on family. So a lot of weekends and times spent out in Dokas, but also on my mother's side in a small French-Canadian community called St. Charles in northeastern Ontario. So I'm a small town girl at heart, and that kind of has lived through off and on over the course of my life. I left northeastern Ontario after high school and went to university in the big city, in the big smoke, as my dad called it. And at the time, I was one of few from my group of friends that even ventured outside of Sudbury, outside of the area. Um, Largely because that's just not something, if you grew up in a small town, there's comfort, there's values alignment. But
Yeah.
there was something in me that just knew that I had to kind of take the risk and go out. So I actually went to the University of Toronto not knowing a single person there, and taking that adventure and challenge out on my own. And from there, just got connected into student politics, graduated, and got my first job at a legal clinic in downtown Toronto. And that's actually
Okay.
where I set out a career and an interest in the criminal justice system. I ended up uh, working as a probation and parole officer a few years after graduation.
Yeah.
I even at one point supervised my own community, and so my own, family, extended family, which obviously in small towns you're the only probation officer, so it's kind of hard to avoid that. But nonetheless, manageable. And then I ended up going to law school. There was people around me that I connected with in my time working at the legal clinic and as a probation officer who pushed me to take on the study of law to a greater degree. And from
Okay.
there, started to understand how, as an Indigenous person, we live in Canada in this world where there are pretty much two different sets of laws that govern my life. One of them is, Karen on reserve and Karen off reserve. And sometimes
Mhm.
there's crossover, but nonetheless, there's two legal frameworks that really kind of impact the way that First Nations folks live their lives. And so from there, worked in First Nations politics to try to, advocate, worked with chiefs of First Nations to advocate for change on the legal justice front. Ended up for 6 years back in the justice system as a political appointee, public appointee. At one point, chaired the Ontario Parole Board. Um, and then from there, ended up trying my hand at consulting and advisory work. So providing advice and then eventually turning up at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, in large part because when you're an advisor and a consultant, you spend quite a bit of time sharing your opinions and your thoughts and perspectives.
I can
And
imagine.
that seemed to grab the attention of the founder of Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Brian Crowley. And then we had a conversation, and here I am today. So a bit of I mean, that's the larger lines. We won't get into the details, but
Yeah, no, you know what? I think that's great. I always want to find out from people whether it's like a singular event that kind of pushes them into their field, their career path, or is it lifelong trajectory that you kind of get set on? So it sounds like that's more where your story kind of starts and comes from, right? The family kind of keeps those ties, those binds back to reserve, but you're also going out and kind of exploring the world.
yeah,
So,
for me, it's not, there was no like one defining moment, that launched my entire career. It's been more so um, kind of following my path and paying attention to the world around me. And
mhm.
where I felt a pull is where I thought I needed to go, which is why, my career kind of weaves in and out of the criminal justice system, the administrative justice system, but also in Indigenous policy and law and advocacy. But really, at the end of the day, in all of those roles, I would say the pull is, if there's an interesting challenge to be addressed or solved for, and you make a good case to me, I'm probably going to join your organization and
Yeah.
join your team and try to fix it. So
I want to
that's
say
to me
on
the
that
common
too.
thread.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the writing that you do. And I've listened to, I think maybe half the catalog that you have for your podcast. Like I've gone through a bunch of them, and you're, I'll say it this way, you're one of the few people that I can stand to listen to on those
Oh,
topics because I think a lot of people, and that might sound weird, but I'll explain it. A lot of people just want to scream and shout in this
yeah,
world,
no.
and you bring like a certain context to a lot of these issues, and very complex issues that are just like drowning in, if it's not stereotypes, it's misinformation, it's all these things. And it's like, how do we cut through kind of the bullshit of it and actually talk about these problems that we have, to concerns, and we're going to get into a lot of this today. I already know we're going to go close to the time, and I'll probably still have a lot of questions for you. But
Can I tell you,
yeah.
give you so I appreciate you observing that about my, my style and how I show up both as an interviewer, but that's how I show up as a person.
Hmm.
And when I say I'm attracted to challenges, it's probably because I was raised to be quite solutions focused and forward looking.
Okay.
I was raised by a dad who was like, a very kind man, but a very, tough and demanding
Hmm.
dad. And he would always say, when we'd come to him crying or with problems as kids do, I don't want to hear it unless you come to me with a solution. Like, what are you going to
Yeah.
do about it? Like, what are the
Yeah.
options here? And I think that's just such a great way to raise kids writ large, such a great way to parent, because it really does program you to kind of pause, assess the situation, but then pushes you to say, here's what I can do about it, or here's what I need from you in order for me to go and solve my problem. And so it doesn't pass the buck on to anybody else. It leaves it within my responsibility and my control to
Yes.
correct the course and then go about, the rest of my journey, so to speak.
It's funny that no matter how many conversations I have on here, and I've found from talking to people from Africa to Australia, everybody in between, it always comes down to agency. Are you a person that takes control of your own life, your own destiny, or do you kind of sit there and go, woe is me, and I'm a victim of everything? Well, that's going to lead you down a certain path. So I'm glad you kind of got to that early, because I was probably going to get to that at some point in the conversation. But no, I
Well, if I
100% agree.
if I could add a tidbit there, like
Hmm.
this is to defy all stereotypes about First Nations folks. Like my dad grew up on the reserve, super poor in the 60s and 70s. And that is the ethos that he raised us with. And in large part because from my community, anyhow, and the family that I come from, that is actually how he was raised,
Hmm.
right? It's that hardworking, mentality. You get up every day, and it's a choice. You can sit and look at, the bad aspects or the less desirable aspects of your life, or you can get up every morning, thank God or Creator for giving you
Hmm.
another day and set out to accomplish something. Get up, work hard, take pride in what you do, and make sure that you're contributing to your family and to your community. And so it really is, to me, like I just think it's so powerful that, being raised by a man who was raised in like, such unfortunate circumstances, would have carried on through, built the life that he did, but then more importantly, made sure that those values and those principles were being instilled in me and my brothers growing up.
Yeah, 100%. You know what, that kind of brings me to one thing I wanted to get into with you here, and just talking on like a historical perspective. So, in your opinion, when we're looking at history and some of the changing views in current times, um, how do you think we should view a lot of the events and things that did happen to Indigenous people? Uh, you know, are we using the proper context? Is context non-existent? That's kind of where I think we are. But how would you explain it to people, especially being a person who grew up kind of like you said between two different worlds?
Yeah, I think we do live in a time where people are living on vibes. We also
Yeah.
live in a time where people will just make up history so that it suits whatever narrative they're pushing at the time, which is wild to me. You have a whole host of folks, general citizens, but also leaders who are essentially just playing make believe every day of their lives. They get up and they make up the context that somehow justifies their words and their actions.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite dangerous, personally. I think we should all be, operating with a certain baseline, historical baseline, if you will, that then creates the context in which we're going to live and coexist in today's world. And so, interestingly enough, you mentioned my podcast. So the March series will focus on our shared history. On
Okay.
this very point is what led me to choose that theme, because I think going back to historians, Indigenous and non, to be able to uncover key points of our shared history that have influenced the relationship over time and getting very real about those moments in time and what they meant then, but more importantly, what's the framework, what's the world that it created for us today, and how we leverage that to inform what we're going to do about our problems, what we're going to do about our challenges, and how we're going to set out in our path looking forward. So, yeah, I think history is super important. Like
Well, if
we're better off if we don't if we don't play make believe, and we
yeah.
just we all operate on the same set of facts, which, in law is a thing. When you go argue a case, both sides will agree on a shared set of facts before they get into the legal issues.
Mhm.
Similar approach to life in terms of what our history is and how we go about, governing in this country.
But maybe on that, do you think we can have honest conversations nowadays? Or is that possible
I mean,
given all
I want to
the
have
cancel
honest
culture?
conversations.
Well, I definitely do. But just the stuff I see that gets put out there from, as you mentioned, politicians. I'll even say like chiefs of police. We'll see it in the justice system. I'll deal with something on the street, and I know what it's like doing that, and then I'll see somebody at the higher ups go to the media and say like the complete opposite, and it's like that's not the truth. When police get accused of being racist, and all these narratives around policing right now, I'm like, I go out every day and have great conversations with people from all backgrounds, all walks of life. And in fact, I would say I would put money on it that most police officers are either mixed race or have relationships now that are biracial. So it's just, to me, at least where I grew up and how I grew up and the world I'm in now, I don't see what everybody's saying, right? Like it's two different things. It's like some people are living in an alternate reality.
Yeah, I think you touched on it just earlier when you said like we kind of live in a world where there's a victim mindset generally.
Mm,
So there's that. And also, I think today, politically, one particular spectrum of the political, one particular group of people on a certain, on the left of the political
hmm.
spectrum have essentially weaponized race, right?
Yeah.
If you question, Canada's history, you're racist.
Yeah.
If you don't agree with this particular policy solution, like right now in BC, it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's, the controversial policy that's being discussed. If you don't support that, or even if you ask questions about it, you're racist, right? Like,
Which you did a
you,
very good podcast on recently. I think it was like your second last episode, maybe two or three ago. But yeah, people should listen to it.
yeah. So all of February, so there'll be 8 episodes that touch on the conflict coming out of well, it's coming out of British Columbia.
Hmm.
The kind of like breaking point seemed to have been when the BC Supreme Court issued the decision in Cowichan last August.
Yeah.
That seemed to be the tipping point. but it's a culmination of, government action over the course of the last decade or two that has really gotten us to this point, which includes the government adopting within domestic policy, within provincial law, this international legal instrument called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is ultimately an international human rights framework.
Hmm.
And so that's really kind of when it comes to implementation. I don't know that the government in 2019 really kind of had a strong idea of what that would look like
Yeah.
tangibly.
Yeah.
And now we're feeling it, right? As the
There, I,
world
I will say on that though,
feels it.
that is, there is a huge disconnect between the decision makers and the ground level.
Yeah.
They imagine all these things happening in a certain way, and it does not translate into reality. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like that's happening, Indigenous or not, with government writ large these days.
yeah.
Like, uh, I think of the last decade federally, and I can't even think of a decision that, a policy decision or directive that have come out of that government where it's been tied to like reality on the ground. It's been a lot of feel goods and nice to haves, a lot of, kind of what I would call is like accessories or decadence, if you will,
Mhm.
but nothing that's like tangibly helped the citizens actually live their lives in a better way on the day to day. And that I think is it created the kind of environment that we're in, the ecosystem, the environment that we're all living in right now, where we're everyone's at their wits' end. There, you see a lot of emotion coming out of folks um, on issues that I don't think should draw that much emotion. But post pandemic, a government that ran on vibes. We're just living in a world now where people are just expressing frustration in various ways,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of our one of our biggest challenges is how do we get people to refocus on what's important here.
Even on that, and just to use Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups as an example, but the theme I was kind of getting, or maybe the idea I was kind of getting from some of your writing and then listening to the show was that essentially a word that kept coming up on the Indigenous side was, c- uh, sorry, I'm blanking on it now.
That's okay.
Was it consistency? I think you were talking about consistency, or I'll find it. But they were
Yeah.
looking for essentially answers. The non-Indigenous side, I think, are people who largely just want to go about their lives. And when the government comes into it, they seem to be the ones that are not taking a ton of the blame, but are responsible for most of it. Like the confusion around a lot of this stuff, the wording being used, the explanations of things, the twisting of history, the facts that are getting put out, and it's two groups of people that are being made to bicker about things, kind of like you're saying, like, should this really be that big of a deal? Like, we have historical precedent, we have agreements, like we can go to these legal documents that just spell it out, but everything's kind of being flipped upside down and turned around.
Yeah, I recently said at a conference that got me a bit of applause, which it was a lawyers conference where generally, lawyers don't express that level of support. So I was pretty excited. And it essentially, how I put it to the room is government really does truly need to get out of the way.
Yeah, and real quick, certainty. Certainty was the
Oh,
word that kept
certainty.
coming
Yeah.
up. I had it marked down here. I just had to find
I
it,
mean,
but
consistency also aligns with that. So
yeah,
you were close
it
enough.
would be
Yeah.
nice too.
Yeah, I like on that. And so, I mean, the two ideas merge here. So, I think what you're seeing a lot what you're hearing a lot from guests on my pod are that everyone's showing up and wanting to be part of the solution. Nobody is afraid to put in the hard work. Like everybody is working hard. But it seems at several points in our respective journeys that we're on a treadmill, right? And it's
Hmm.
called the government treadmill. Like we just can't
Hmm.
kind of like make the thing happen or get the project over the line because government can't figure out, what the duty to consult is in this particular case, or it needs to regulate on environment or this or that and the other. And then you see from you or you hear from my guests, each one of them has accomplished a big thing. So season 1 in December, season 2 in January, each guest has accomplished a huge project or is now running a company that has reached a great degree of success. And everyone will say the minute we can get government out of the way is actually when things start to move. And
Hmm.
so some folks have worked on major projects. Like I think back to my guest, I've had her twice now, the former chief of Haisla Nation in northern BC, who
Okay.
negotiated majority ownership of a pipeline, right? An LNG project, Cedar LNG, who sat at the table with industry, who picked their partners themselves, who basically did all of the work directly with the industry players to get the deal negotiated and the project up off the ground. And then at various points through their journey where they needed to, they went to Ottawa and said, we've done all the work. Everyone's been consulted. Everyone consents to this thing. It's a great business deal. Just sign on the dotted line, right? Like just no, don't even stand up. Just sit down at the desk, put the rubber stamp on the thing. We're going to go back and get this project moving.
Hmm.
Thank you very much. Do no more. Please do no more. And I think that by and large, when we talk about creating certainty, everyone has a role to play, right?
Hmm.
And with government governing on vibes or, uh, you know,
I feel like
picking
it's
and choosing.
pandering for votes,
Well, this
honestly.
isn't
Like,
picking and choosing what side or what piece of information they're going to support that day.
yeah.
Like that all serves to create uncertainty, right? That all serves to essentially destabilize what we believe to be true.
Hmm.
There's no more tangibles around us. There's nothing for people to kind of like hang on to as a source of stability and predictability when the government itself isn't even operating in reality. So yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, how do we fix it? I think smarter, more competent people need to run for politics, but the challenge
Yeah.
is nobody smart wants to run for politics in
Well,
today's world.
that's
And
funny that you
so,
mentioned that because even conversations I've had about national security on here, and one of the people I talked to, Dennis Molinaro, wrote a great book recently called Under Assault. We were talking about just the relationship between Canada and China, and I asked him, "Do you think, the people we're sending over to do these deals now, and everyone's saying like, I don't think Canada's at the level to negotiate or do these certain deals with China directly. Do you think we have the sophistication? Do we have the people in there that we need to be doing the deals to make sure that while we're trading, we're also being safe on the national security side?" And that was part of the debate or conversation that we were having. And I was thinking that applied so much in this same situation here, where it's like what we really need are people who have the smarts, but I want to say also the backbone to say no or yes, but give a definitive answer and give your reasoning why. And I think most people can accept a yes or no answer if you can give them the why behind it. And as long as it's somewhat rational, then I think they'll be okay with it. But in today's world, I don't get that from politicians, especially, but even, administration, wherever it might be, the bureaucracy, all the middle management, like it's kind of permeated down to where we don't have that leadership at multiple levels. I think it's a huge gap.
yeah, I think that the founder of Macdonald-Laurier Institute gets it right when he says, MLI, the think tank, needs to be, we're the ones saying the hard thing, and we're the
Mhm.
ones saying the hard thing first.
Well, some of you need to run for politics. There you go.
Yeah. Actually, some former MLI folks are actually currently elected. Jamil Javani Shuv
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. He does
and
some really good stuff. I really
yeah,
like his work.
yeah. Oh, yeah. The two of them are really paving the way there. It's interesting what comes to mind when you say, we got to get back to saying, the true thing, which in this world is the bold thing, right?
Hmm.
I think back this past summer, every weekend there's this spot that families from Nipissing First Nation and Doki's First Nation kind of meet up on the lake. And it's just a spot that our families have been meeting for like centuries.
Yeah.
And any given kind of day or weekend, it'll be like a boat full of family who shows up. You never really know who's going to be at the spot. And I just published a couple of what I thought were bolder pieces, and I'm not afraid to say the hard thing, but I do get nervous sometimes about putting it out there. In that, you know, I don't want to welcome chaos into my life. I don't want people,
Yeah.
yelling at me.
Yeah.
And so I try to, in my writing, when I say the thing that I think needs to be said, I really try to take the reader along on the journey that's going on inside my head, right? Like, why am I saying this bold thing? Let me
Yeah.
tell you why. And I take you along and I explain why, I arrive at the conclusion that I do. Anyhow, so I'm sitting there and I see one of the elders from my community coming over, and I'm like, oh man, like that essay just got published like 4 days
They
ago.
read the piece. Yeah.
I'm for sure like I'm getting it. She's coming to, to tell me what she thinks. And so I'm bracing myself. And keep in mind, it's like a Saturday afternoon in July where you're supposed to just be like chill and
Yeah.
enjoying your weekend. And I'm like sweating profusely, like in that moment. And she comes to me and says, I've been reading your stuff. And I'm like, oh, here it goes. And she's like, and you're doing a great job and keep at it. And I was,
Nice.
whoa, that is not what I was expecting. And so in talking to some friends, because it's a moment that really like stressed me out, and I talked to some friends afterwards who are Indigenous, and I shared my experience, and they too pointed out, like, yeah, you say things that are actually hard to read and hard to process from time to time. Like you do say
Hmm.
the spicy thing, if we can call it that. They're like, but the way you lay it out, it's based in reality. It's fact. It's common sense.
It goes
There's
beyond the
always like
headlines
a
and the clickbait.
reason for it. Yeah. And I find that's in large part what's wrong with our leadership today is that people are not willing and wanting to say the hard thing. I would say in large part in politics because they're driven by votes. And
Yeah.
so if your demographic, if your constituency believes, are a bunch of anti-Semites, then for whatever reason, your party now believes that it's okay to trot out anti-Semitic tropes, right?
Hmm.
And that I think is problematic for a lot of reasons. Does it chip away at certainty here in Canada? 100%. But like you say, from a security perspective, that grows into a much larger and more risky situation and picture here in Canada, in my view.
Do you think a lot of the cancellation of historical figures or maybe the twisting of history, like has that had a major impact on how people really understand the relationships between Indigenous, non-Indigenous people? Because I feel like, when those things aren't put in a historical context, like, yeah, the founders of the country, they could have had slaves, they could have treated indigenous people poorly, but they also created this great nation that we all live in now. And it has led to where you have things such as human rights. Nothing is perfect, it all needs to still be worked on. But when we just bash a whole group of people, which slowly turns into like, you're that group, I'm this group, you know, I just find it's like it shuts down all the conversations, and now people don't listen to history at all, or they don't view it in the context that they should. I think that's one of the things that has made this the most difficult time in some ways to actually get things done.
Yeah, and people today want to punish the bad people of the bad people of yesterday.
Yeah.
And I find that so strange, because we are living in completely different times than, let's say, John A. Macdonald in the mid to late 1800s was at the time.
Hmm.
Um, they had a mission and mandate to establish presence here in North America. And this is a man who was simply accomplishing the task that he was set out to do, or achieve the vision that he had, before him, and his group or his party. Um, when I think back to me, that, like, that's the 1800s. The point of contact happened, what, 300 years before that.
Hmm.
And if you look at history, now this is a large part why I'm kind of diving into this in March on my podcast. If you actually look into the history, we coexisted quite well in the first 200 or so years post contact.
Yeah.
Like, we had European explorers coming in, uh, meeting nations on the shores of, like, Indigenous leaders are teaching Europeans how to stay alive, how to
Yeah.
navigate the terrain, how to kind of establish life and here in North America. And when you look at how all of that was done, well, it was actually in accordance to the Indigenous laws and protocols of whatever territories that they were in. You have marriages that would have occurred. I've read history books where, those marriages would have happened between, let's say, like a European explorer and an indigenous woman. It would have
Hmm.
happened according to the protocol of the women, and their nation. So,
Yeah.
or business and trade was in large part governing, how we all interacted with one another. There was a lot of overlap in territories between nations that were governed through, like, deep diplomacy instruments
Hmm.
and protocols. And for whatever reason, we don't want to talk about that. Like, on one on one side, it doesn't serve the narrative that we're victims. And on the other side, you have folks who are like, no, Canada started at 1867. And I'm like, well, no, we have this whole awesome history in the
Hmm.
300 years before that, that actually, I think, rest at the foundation of what we should, take pride of here in our home. When we think back to 1867, the Confederation, it served a purpose at the time. You had provinces who were under threat, who came together essentially to face that threat and really establish a presence, in order to protect,
Yeah.
protect themselves and what we had. Um, and nations played a role in that. When we think about the 1812 war, right? Like,
Hmm.
Canada is what it is today in large part because of the collaboration between uh, European explorers, newcomers, and nations who sought to protect the same territory. And so I'm not a historian. I just know the larger lines. There are people who are so much more well versed than I am in this stuff. But ultimately, it really is, you kind of, it's a choice, right? Like,
Hmm.
you could look at history and pick and choose what serves your narrative today, or you could look at history for what it is and appreciate the foundation of the place that we all call home today.
I think it'd be curious to kind of take like a almost a mosaic of like all the people who work on Indigenous history, Canadian history, and see how they tell it. It makes me think of reading Dr. Cook's book. So he was with the Canadian War Museum. He recently passed away. Uh, but when he was writing in there, he talks about how the Americans frame their history, and this is all around World War II. But the Americans, theirs is all about, celebration, and we conquered in these big battles and we're kick ass and we're like doing all this awesome stuff. But on the Canadian side, it was a lot of like depressing stuff, talking about how bad we were for doing this thing or that thing. And we put people in camps, and oh, we gotta like beat ourselves, and it's like, okay, there's definitely the bad side, but the way we frame it, the lens we seem to use is always I don't know if it's just fully negative, but it's kind of like Debbie Downer. And that's how we always want to tell stuff. Like, we're just so bad. Oh, we're just not that great. We did all these bad things. Meanwhile, everyone else is like celebrating. And
Yeah, yeah.
so it's
We're
like, I just,
warriors.
yeah. And I wonder
Yeah.
if, if you were to take Canadian history and just look at it right across, take all the biggest people who talk about that, who write about it, um, and just see, you know, how do they frame it a lot of the time? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it down the line? And I think that would kind of really color how people go about and pass on stories. What do they focus on? How do we choose to tell our story? So,
Yeah, I've written about this before where my solution for that is we have to recognize leaders that predate Confederation and include Indigenous leaders, right?
mhm.
So like Chief Pontiac, who, was one of the key players in pushing back against the Americans and eventually asserted, his presence for Indigenous people here in Canada against the British. Well, it wasn't Canada then, but you know what I mean,
Yeah,
in the territory. But really, pushes back and says, we saw, we're in conversation with you, British Crown, but we don't want a ruler, we want a neighbor, right? Like
hmm,
we want a good partner. And so when you break down, I'm thinking specifically 1763 Royal Proclamation. The crown comes in, meets with representatives from 23 different Indigenous nations on the shore of the Niagara River uh, in 1764 to essentially confirm what they had discussed in 1763.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm like losing you. So essentially, there's two legal mechanisms, is what I'm trying to say. So you have in 1763, the Crown and says we're comes in and says we're responsible for Indians and all Indian lands.
hmm,
To which the nations are like, wait a minute, we never asked you to be responsible for us. Let's sit down and have a chat, and let's go through this treaty process whereby we spend some weeks together in the summer of 1764 to reinterpret what we believe, the relationship is and what it should be. And we cook that into a treaty, which is now called the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. And so
okay,
for this year or two, you have engagement between Indigenous nations and Crown representatives as they try to figure out, what kind of relationship they have here, who's going to live where, who's responsible for what. And it truly is all cooked into an agreement. And so
yeah,
when I hear, stolen land or, genocide and whatnot, that's not to say that people weren't killed. They were.
hmm,
But I think it speaks to what was happening here in these lands at the time where people were just generally at war, right? It
yeah.
was to take Western expansion, take over land, settle the land,
I say that's
establish
human
presence.
history worldwide in general. It was about war and conquering, and I want to own things. I want to put, I want a statue of me.
And what we have is a collision of worldviews, right?
Hmm.
Like indigenous laws and governance systems, generally speaking, are not about personal and private ownership. Generally, it's about collective ownership, if you will, but not really ownership. It's more like collective responsibility and duty
Yeah.
to the land, to one another. Um, and you have that system clashing with, private fee simple, private property, that actual concept of, of ownership.
Hmm.
Um, and so you have a huge clash. And so anyhow, I'm like
No,
deviating from
you're
my
doing
point,
fine.
but 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 when I think of my history of my family and in our story, uh like have we faced hardships that have been imposed on us by the British government? Yes.
Hmm.
But do I understand that that is what we've faced and overcome, and that's not who we are? Also, yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that's my entire identity is not cooked in to the victim narrative. Like it's just no, like nobody, Indigenous or not, should look at themselves and their families and establish their entire identity set around a victim narrative. It's just, I don't think it's healthy. Number one, but number two, like what kind of what kind of world does that create for you, your family, your community, and quite frankly, your country?
Yeah.
And which is why I think, in large part, my tendency to look at solutions, to look at the good, to look at like kind of the tools or weapons that we have within our reach to be able to like build in the now and build in the future and right some of the wrongs that we can,
Mm.
but understand that they can't all be addressed or fixed, and we're going to have to kind of find some peace with that. But the important part is that we allow it to inform how we move forward so we don't get it wrong again,
Mhm.
and to make sure that we're building out in a good way for everyone.
That makes me kind of wonder on, what are some of the solutions? Like, how do we bring people to like at least have that type of mentality, but also, you see in the news, and I've actually experienced this both working at a bank as a teller and in policing. Like you see these huge payouts of things for past crimes, we'll call them, historical wrongs. You know, uh, do you think something such as that is a solution, or does that actually can that kind of hurt the narrative or the understanding that people like non-Indigenous people might have toward Indigenous? And maybe if I hope I'm framing that question correctly. There's so much going on in my head right now. And I just think a lot of the stuff that gets put out there and some of the solutions, I don't think they're good solutions necessarily. Um, and I think like maybe people are just being paid to go away or paid to shut up, or, it's like, can we do better than that? And I did a post on this recently on social media, but it's like, how do we get people to a point where they have that agency, like we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, where they're self-sustaining, they're, equal partners when we talk about pipelines or resources or whatever it might be. But they're also not, relying on the government for whatever it might be, for handouts of some kind. Like how do we get to that point?
Yeah. So short response to negotiated settlement compensation. I think there are injustices that have taken place, and yeah, people need to be held accountable.
Hmm.
And that means that, there is going to, they're going to have, the government's going to have to right the wrongs where it can. Um, my thoughts right now, we're seeing coming out of British Columbia, like 70 or 80% of the province is not treaty territory, meaning that it's quote, the legal nature of it is unresolved.
Yeah.
And that nations can then essentially go to court and make claim that they are the rightful title owner to a particular territory. And we're facing a situation where there is fear of land back, essentially. And what's
Like
the
people are gonna come
alternative?
in and say, you like whoever you are on this land, like get out. This is someone else's now.
So we're seeing it in two cases, the Haida Gwaii agreement that was negotiated with the BC government. And we're seeing it in this Cowichan decision that says, this part of Richmond, BC, is
Yeah.
actually, there's enough evidence here to say that it's actually Aboriginal title, and it does actually engage private property, right? And
Mm.
so you have two instances right now that are part of the bigger narrative, society, our big conversation happening right now. And so to me, I that falls in the quote unquote literal land back pocket. And people are like, what's the solution? Surely, we can't, engage with people's private property, which, to be clear, like, I also don't think it's healthy to proceed with a literal land back where it engages private property owners. To me,
Hmm.
that falls on the government that's been, various governments that have been in power over the last 100+ years that have failed to resolve the legal nature of that particular land
Well,
or
and I
territory.
think it was one of your recent guests who said on that wasn't the taking the land back wasn't part of their ask or the question, but you
But the
know,
court basically put, like, that's what the court issued in its decision. Uh,
yeah.
the Cowichan people say we're not interested in taking the land from private property owners.
But if
And
even if they say that if the door is still open for them to ever come down the road, 10, 20, 100 years from now, then that uncertainty will always be there and that'll hurt homeowners, investment, business, all that stuff. I think people going forward is like, again, back to the certainty. Give us a yes or a no.
so the court, well, this is what the court does, right? The
Mhm.
the the courts say, no, this area has, like, all the evidence shows that the Cowichan people should have title to this particular, territory or land. Uh, and then that becomes the question of, well, wait a minute. If it's Aboriginal title, but it's private property, then who actually owns this land? Which is kind of what has put everyone into a tailspin. And then so many folks are now recognizing that, oh my God, like, that's not just in Richmond. Like 70 to 80% of the province is not resolved through treaty, which means that it's open to quote unquote debate, right? Like,
Yeah.
any nation could come in and claim. And so that's kind of what's pushed people, and rightfully so, into a panic and questioning government, and really wondering, what the heck's going on around here. I thought I was safe, with my, with my house and my little, patch of land that I own.
Yep.
Um, but the question is that, it goes back to, is there an injustice? Yes. What is the solution? In that case, is it better to go to a negotiated, like, financial compensation, right? What are the
Yeah.
alternatives? And most of the country, when you talk about those big cash settlement payouts, most of the country up until this point has largely gone for negotiated settlement via large, financial compensation.
And that would be so that then basically the claim to the land itself, like the ownership piece, is then settled.
Like, if
See,
you look at land claims, so I think back, like, Indigenous folks generally like to kind of um, complain about former Prime Minister Harper. But he actually implemented one of the most helpful policies that this country has ever seen. It's the Specific Land Claims Tribunal. I worked at it as a summer law student when it was first kind of setting up. And essentially, it allows grievances over land and treaty to go to a process outside of court, to a tribunal with specialists in that particular kind of area, to sit down, have a show of evidence, have the back and forth, present,
Mhm.
all the arguments, and to essentially push the parties towards negotiation, or, the tribunal will issue a decision. But by and large, folks, once they trot out all the evidence, are really encouraged. You kind of have a sense of where the case is going, encouraged to then settle out. And there's been a ton of settlements coming out of the Spec Claims Tribunal,
Yeah.
and in large part because Prime Minister Harper and conservative value generally is, to create a society where there's certainty and stability.
Hmm.
And so but nobody talks about that, right? Like, we,
Yeah.
because you can't rage on solutions, right? But it's been, by and large, very helpful at resolving
Okay.
a lot of these questions of land that nations are, like, legally, it is kind of legally and rightfully theirs, but they've gone and said, this doesn't make sense. We don't want to disturb our neighbors. we want to be a good neighbor. We're
Mm.
going to negotiate a cash settlement deal and everyone's going to move on with their lives, right?
Well,
So there's been that happening for 15, 20 years now, maybe even
yeah.
longer.
I
And
don't know how, say they didn't do cash settlement and they said, no, like we actually want the land. I think you end up in a situation where you might be in like getting into little wars with people. Like people are going to
that's the
defend their
risk.
property. So it's like, what are we going to do outside
Then
of
we
this?
then we enter into civil war, an era of civil war. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's,
to your point, like to what level or degree are governments willing to vibe,
yeah.
so that they benefit politically before they,
And
before it gets really bad.
aside from the land stuff specifically, and when I look at some of the solutions, so I look at some of the residential school, the history with that, and then some of the things that came out of it. I'll go back to when I was working as a bank teller, and I remember someone coming in. I was at the front counter. This is in downtown Winnipeg, so I'm working right in the core of the city. In the one of the towers I was in were a bunch of law offices, and they were responsible for. They were working on behalf of the government, handing out the checks. We would have homeless people come in, and I'm presuming their background was something Indigenous because they come in with the checks from this lawyer that was working with the government. But we would have drug addicted, homeless people come in with checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars, come up to the teller. I'm sitting there and I remember a guy put a check down and it was either like $300,000 or $400,000. And he asked for cash. So I said to him, I was like, first of all, everything's digital. There's maybe like 50 grand in that machine behind me. So there's no way you're getting cash. Then I tried to talk to him about a basic savings account. He's just, yeah, he didn't want any part of that. But it was three or $400,000. And I'm looking at this person in front of me going, is that a good solution? Like and again, this, government's money is tax money. So it's your money. And just giving away this money, I don't think people would agree with that. So it's like, okay, on the land side, yeah, that might be a good solution and it works because, yeah, we don't want a civil war. But when it comes to people who have uh, addiction issues, mental health, like, can we maybe put them on a program that helps them with life situations and whatever they might be dealing with? But to just hand cash of those amounts to people was mind blowing to me. And then it also, like, fast forward about 12 years, 10 years, I was doing a secondment in our sexual assault unit, and we had a lot of people. Maybe it was a different settlement or something with the federal government, but we would have people call in, and all they needed was a police file number, and they could file a claim and basically get money from the government. And it had to do with residential schools, like if you were abused in a residential school. So I'm working up in this unit. We would get calls from people, and they would say, here's my name. I was abused at this school back in this range of years, but I don't know the priest's name or the pastor's name or whatever they are. I don't know their name. I think everyone's probably dead now because it's like, they'd be 100 and something. And the school itself is now like a strip mall. So there's literally nothing to go on. And we just gave out these file numbers. And that blew my mind as well. I go, what the hell are we doing here? So I feel like in a lot of situations, you know, we're not doing good by all these people. We're not doing good by all these different nations. And it's just like a quick and easy fix. Maybe it looks good on paper or in the news, but I think we're just creating way bigger problems. And then it
Yeah.
also, and sorry, just real quick, it also makes a lot of the police officers and non-Indigenous people not particularly like that group because they go like, well, we're just giving them all this money and look what they're doing with it. So yeah, it just creates problems all around.
Yeah. Um, so when a person is in a car accident, they have insurance
Hmm.
and they can go and claim through their car insurance uh, benefits, right?
Yeah.
Let's say their leg's broken and they miss work. You can, you know, ask the insurance company to cover to cover your wages for X amount of time. Sometimes a person who's in a car accident will sue the other party for the injuries and the injustice caused to them as a result of the car accident to which they did not cause. The other person caused it.
Hmm.
And they go to court and, all the evidence is laid out and the case is made. And at the end of it, the court either awards damages or they settle out and there's financial compensation because the evidence there's sufficient evidence there to point out that it'll be X outcome, but hey, let's negotiate this down and be reasonable. Same idea with residential schools and day schools. In
Mm.
that, you had a government policy that for, I think it's 74 years, that mandated Indigenous kids between 4 and 15 to be removed from their homes in order to attend residential schools. Um, it was mandatory for 20 or so years of those 70 years, where the RCMP was involved in actually going into homes and removing children,
Yeah.
and really kind of playing an active role in the implementation of that law, of that policy. And so it was enforced with great rigor. And then you have the kids who get to the school that is church run, state run, state mandated church run. And not everybody, but many, if not most, of the kids attending the schools are abused in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm.
At no point, did they choose, it wasn't of their choosing to attend the
Yeah.
school, right? And so when you look at the law and what the law says about uh, not just Indigenous kids, but anybody and everybody, baselines, abuses should be tested at court in order to hold up the very values that rest at the foundation of our society here in Canada. And this all gets tested at court, to which someone is held responsible for that happening, right?
Hmm.
And at some point, there's enough evidence that points to the state and the church, and the courts say, we're not going to fight this all the way through. There's enough evidence against us that this was not a good thing, that
Yeah.
laws were broken and the impacts are quite severe. So let's negotiate an award, a remedy that attempts to make whole this situation that we caused, right? Let's
Yeah.
keep in mind, like, I recently, used this term, like, this isn't an Indian problem, right? Like, no Indigenous person or leader anywhere was like, yeah, let's do this thing that's going to lead to
Yeah.
a great degree of severe impact, right?
I don't think there's any question about who's responsible or like that
Yeah.
there was injustice and all these things were done. It's more with the solution.
So then they negotiate at court, what the award, what the remedy looks like.
Hmm.
And part of the long list of remedies that they lay out is financial compensation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so this is not inconsistent with any other situation where a person has been aggrieved personally, right?
Yeah. I just, handing people like hundreds of thousands of dollars when they just, they're not going to use it to make themselves whole, in a lot of cases. I'm not saying the majority or anything, but just, um, it just seemed questionable to
Irresponsible.
me. Well, yeah, that, and it's just, I find it's always like anything with the government is they just want to kind of like cut all the attachments and just be like, here you go, we're all done, see you later. And off you go. It's like, maybe if we created like a network of mental health addictions professionals who are specifically trying to get people connected with their community and give them all these different paths out of that a certain lifestyle, you know, could we have, instead of just always throwing money in the pot, it's like, it just seemed like such a, I don't know, it blew my mind. And then to see
So
it that far apart, it's like it's still going. We're still giving all this money here. And I don't even know, when did I work at the bank? It'd be like 2010, 2012, something. And then, in 2020, I'm still seeing it. It's like hundreds of thousands of dollars just constantly going out. And it's like, how do we end that, but also get people whole again? So,
yeah. So as part of the residential school settlement, there was money there for
mhm.
commemoration, for treatment, for supports, for language revitalization. Like there's a whole host of, if you actually look at the settlement document itself, there's
Okay.
like 27 items listed there on how, all the various points that they covered to quote unquote make the situation whole again. A cash out was part of that. And when I hear you say, this person who's, struggling with addiction and living on the street shows up with a check for $400,000, knowing this, how the system was laid out, that person, it means that that person actually lived through the worst of it.
Yeah.
So the
Oh, yeah.
more amount of money that a person received,
Yeah.
the kind of like the more aggrieved their experience, they are, the worse their experience was.
Hmm.
And so I think we both agree that, we want people to be healthy. And what I hear from you is that, you're struggling to wrap your head around how money is going to help that person kind of get back on track. And this is where the mainstream justice system is questionable, because
Mm.
if we look at, indigenous laws and systems, the mechanisms that were in place prior to this kind of British system being imposed on us, actually the mechanisms actually sought to correct and rebalance that individual and wrap that person with the right supports
Okay.
that they needed. And when I say support, I don't mean like loving kindness and hugs and kisses. I mean like, tough grannies and tough aunties who like made sure that that person, was on the right path and like pushed them to like deal with whatever issue they had and whatnot. And you still see a lot of that happening in our communities. You just don't see about it, you don't hear about it in the media. It's not shared with you. But do I agree that like the mainstream system throwing cash at a problem like that isn't going to necessarily solve all our problems? Yeah, I agree with you on that point. What is the solution? Right now, there are 50 nations across the country that have opted out from the Indian Act and are completely governing themselves.
Mm,
So,
okay.
so for me, the solution is anytime government gets involved, it's going to end up in a bad situation, right?
Yeah.
And so,
I totally agree.
and so, like I think of like a community like Nishka. Everyone knows who Nishka is because they just announced support for a pipeline, the Sealisms pipeline that the Carney government, through their major projects office, is more than happy to kind of push through and support. Nishka, 30 years ago, signed a modern treaty. They were like, thank you, government. You've done more than enough damage. We are now prepared to get behind the wheel of our own bus here. We're going to sign on the dotted line. You're over there. This is our agreement, our modern treaty. We're now responsible for ourselves. And since then, they've spent 30 years rebuilding their local economy. They are partnered to several resource development projects in their territory. When you talk to them, their goal is to be completely sovereign and self-sustaining, I think within the next like 10 to 20 years, which is an
Wow.
absolute incredible story, right?
Hmm.
And so, big picture here, like it's hard to go and kind of like help people solve their individual problems I'm more of a fan of like, what world can we create around these people that maybe we can't help that generation, but we can make sure that, justice is served, so to speak. But what world can we create for the next generations who are coming up behind them to make sure that this doesn't happen again
Mm-hmm.
and to put them in the best possible position to be able to leverage their own agency and build their lives the way that, this Western world is supposed to allow happen.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That brings us, I've kept you 10 minutes over time. I said get you on an hour. Um, but I think that's a really good place to wrap it up. I could honestly talk with you for hours about this, and we didn't even get to half the stuff. If people don't know, like I look at, can I, does this even show up because of this stupid background?
I know the
I don't know. You
background
can't see
really
the
throws
notes I
it
wrote
off.
down here. I got a lot of questions, but I find this stuff fascinating. And I really do appreciate you doing the podcast. I think it's a necessity uh, because just where people go for their information um, right now, it's not good places. It's X, it's Instagram, and they're watching the video clips of people freaking out or doing stupid things, and it's like that's their source of news. We need a much better perspective, an educated perspective on this, and people willing to talk about it. So yeah, I want to say
Well,
thank you
maybe
for
I'll
that.
come back and we can hammer out some other items on your
Yeah.
list together. Uh, I know there's a lot to, there's a lot to work out. And I'm, I say often, never underestimate the power of a simple conversation.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things I did want to get to, but we will have to come back to it, is just talking about Alberta and separation, and then just how that affects all the treaties and different things. And when we speak of Indigenous people and them as their own nation or nations, the differences, the compare and contrast between that, I thought was kind of interesting given the times, but we'll save that for another time. So thank
I've
you for
I've
being.
got I've got some nuggets, golden nuggets on that one, so I'll have to come back.
We'll have to get you back before Alberta separates. I'm just
Hopefully
joking.
not.
I have
Hopefully
no
not.
insight into
Hopefully not.
that. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.